We are going to begin the funeral service for Mr. Ronald Mark Swartz. If you have a cell phone, I'd ask you kindly to place it in the silent mode at this time or turn it completely off. I'd also like to welcome, on behalf of the family, everyone visiting us via live stream. Thank you for attending. And services will be conducted by Rabbi Rachel Heaps of Temple Jeremiah in Northfield. And we're going to start with the ancient tradition of cutting of the kriya. So if we could have the family who are wearing the ribbons, please rise.
Mourning is the price we pay for having the courage to love others. Even in grief, we know that the wonder of human life is too complex and too magnificent to be memorialized in endless pain. The gifts of spirit that our loved ones gave us cannot be weighed, and they cannot be measured, nor can they even be tarnished by time. Even in our darkest hours, we know that some of their light and some of their warmth will always be with us, bringing comfort and courage, and in the fullness of time, healing and peace. We remember Ron, loving father, loving husband, wonderful brother, grandfather, uncle, teacher, friend, so many things to so many people. And we join our hearts together to give comfort and strength to his family. Mourning is a time filled with many emotions, many memories, both bitter and sweet. We begin our service with the recitation of psalms and prayers, thus linking Ron's life with the millennia-old tradition of the Jewish people and the eternity of God. Perhaps the most familiar prayer we have at times like this is the 23rd Psalm. And it speaks of someone walking through one of the most difficult periods of their life, walking through this shadow. And it also speaks of that psalmist having trust and faith in those around them. That even in the darkest times, there's love and support. There's memory and caring. There's a reason to take another step forward. That even in that shadow, there's grace and goodness provided in that memory and provided in that community. Adonai rohi lo echsar bino tesheyar bitzeni Amei menuchot yenach aleini nafshi yeshovev yancheni v'maglet tzedek leman shemo gam ki elech beged salmavet lo ira ra ki ata imadi shivtechanu mishantecha hemayanachamuni ta'aroch lefanai shulchan neged sorerai t'shanta v'shemen roshi kosi revaya ach tov v'chesed yirdefuni kol yemei chayai v'shavti beveit Adonai leorech yamim. On the inside of our pamphlet, we read the translation of this 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. In moments like this, when our hearts are so full and our lives have a tear within them, it can be hard to put words to our feelings. It can be hard to say what's happening on the inside and be able to express to those who care for us and those who want to support us, to really tell them what we're thinking. In those moments, our tradition gives us words to say, words like this psalm, but it also gives us moments of reflection, moments where we can gather ourselves and be able to say even the simplest word in our own minds and start to gather ourselves for what comes next. We take a moment of personal reflection on Ron's life and on the impact he had on so many. Esainai el hecharim me'ain yavo ezri. Esainai el hecharim me'ain yavo ezri. Ezri me'im Adonai, Osei shamayim va'aretz. Eretz Ezri Me'im Adonai Osei Shamayim V'aretz. I turn my eyes to the mountains. From where will my help come? My help comes from Adonai, maker of heaven and earth. God will not let your foot give way. Your guardian will not slumber. See, the guardian of Israel neither slumber nor sleeps. Adonai is your guardian. Adonai is your protection at your right hand. By sun the day will not strike you, nor the moon by night. Adonai will guard you from all harm. God will guard your life. Adonai will guard your going and your coming, now and forever. Ron had such an impact. And to give just a little taste of that impact, we have a number of people who want to share a memory or two, beginning with Alan, his son-in-law, Jerry and Rick, his friends, Barry, his brother, and then Marla, his daughter.
We'd like to thank everyone for the outpouring of support remembering Ron. It means a lot to us that you're here to honor him. As you know, as many of you know, Ron was very inquisitive. He loved meeting new people and getting to know them. He loved to schmooze with everybody. He was just a kind soul. The first time I met Ron, Marla warned me that her dad liked to ask a lot of questions. And sure enough, we met for dinner at Gibson's. The first question Ron asked was, "Where are your parents from?" Me being a little bit obnoxious, I said they were sharecroppers from Alabama. He loved the joke. He would mention it to me once a year. He never spoke ill about anyone or anything. If he didn't like anything, like a meal or a play or a movie, he would never say, "I didn't like it" or "it was horrible." He would just say it was mediocre. "Ron, did you like the meal you ordered?" He clearly didn't like it, but he again would just say, "It was mediocre." In our household, there is a running joke. If Marla and I say if something is mediocre, Dana and Ian would always respond as, "Was it really mediocre? Or was it Grandpa mediocre?" Ron liked to toast every occasion or meal, no matter where we were. We had an annual tradition of taking the kids to McDonald's for lunch at every Thanksgiving, just to get them out of the house while Marla and Sue cooked. Dana, Ian, all four of us would go to McDonald's for an early lunch. While there, we would watch the Lions game because they were always an early game on Thanksgiving, and a lot of times they would play the Bears, two bad teams. All four of us would be sitting at the table, Dana eating her chicken nuggets, Ian playing with his Happy Meal toy, and Ron would just lift his cup up, his disposable McDonald's cup, and say, "Cheers." We would all then toast cheers. And speaking of meals, Ron loved to taste everything, just a bite or a taste, and he had an eclectic palate. Marla and I had a guessing game of what Ron would order off the menu. He would order the most random foods because he had an inquisitive nature, and it applied to food as well, whether it was sardines, foie gras, or a bacon cheeseburger. Ron loved trying food and splitting it. We'd be sitting around the dinner table, and if there was just one chicken tender left, he would go, "Who wants to split it with me?" The happies even applied to a banana split. One time we were on vacation in Florida in an ice cream store, and he wanted a banana split sundae, but only with a half a banana. Why? Because that's how Ron rolled. However, the ice cream guy looked at him and he responded, "What am I going to do with half a banana?" It's still a popular saying with Dana and Ian. Ron was quite adventurous in his younger days. Rogers Park was small to him. He wanted to get out and not only see the world, but change the world. But first, he drove a taxi cab in Chicago in 1968 during the riots. But he would like to say he didn't cause the riots. He was a short order cook a suburban middle school history teacher. He used to hitchhike across the country, not just once, but multiple times, whether it was from Chicago to New York, Boston to Chicago, or even Chicago to Union Pier, Michigan, to meet Sue there. Ron was an expert hitchhiker back in the day. In fact, he's the only person I know to hitchhike. Speaking of Union Pier, it was one of Ron and Sue's happy places. Sue started going there as a kid every summer, spending time at one of her aunt's cottages. Ron grew to love the area and passed it along to Marla and I. For years, they stayed at various bed and breakfasts, going to all the restaurants such as Skip's, Casey's, and Rosie's. And then he just loved it when we bought a house there. Every time he came out to Union Pier, he wanted to say, as he says, survey the property, to check out the landscaping. He loved exploring the area with me, taking lots of walks on the winding streets or beaches. Now, during his 20s, Ron and Sue traveled extensively and lived abroad in Europe and Israel, where they spent time on a kibbutz. They also spent their grad days in New York City, and they always spoke so fondly of their time there. Eventually, they settled in the Detroit suburbs, where he became a professor at Oakland University. Ron and his friends wanted to change the world. They had big ideas and thoughts. That is one of the reasons why he became a philosophy professor. And not just a philosophy professor, but one of education. And in this field, he was world famous. Random people in his field from all over the world would contact him, whether they were from Tokyo or Buenos Aires. They would ask him questions about his books or papers that he authored. Speaking of books, Ron loved books. Many of these books were about people that I've never heard of, but he admired. They were philosophers, education philosophers, and giants in his field, like John Dewey, Karl Popper, and Bertrand Russell. And he loved Albert Einstein. His collection of books included at least 30 involving Einstein. Poor Sue was always helping him arrange the books, moving or schlepping his books all over the condo. Now we're going back to food for a minute. Ron knew and loved every greasy spoon in Chicago and the Detroit area. Am I right? Yeah. And with his incredible memory, he remembered if he'd been there before. Once I took him to an Italian beef joint, and he remarked that the last time he was at this place was 15 years ago with his brother Robert. He had an incredible memory. He knew everyone's birthday, anniversary, he knew everyone's family tree. He was also good with dates, but not time. We have a joke in the house, Swartz time. He and Sue were always early or on time for everything. And they sure did pass it along to their daughter. Now, while he was on time, he wasn't always good at getting things done. For that, he had a famous saying. He had said this often, that he was a day late, but with an extra $1. He loved his grandchildren. He loved taking them to sporting events, whether it was the Cubs or Bulls games. He loved to play golf, and he loved to watch golf on TV. But at the end, every time we sit down for a meal and someone says cheers, I'll think of Ron. So when you come back to our house today for Shiva and you pick up a glass, remember to say cheers to Ron.
Jerry?
Good morning. Just for the record, I hitchhike too. And I know there's at least one other hitchhiker in the room who's going to be talking after me. Maybe there's some others. It's hard to believe, but it happens. (1964). In my freshman year at the University of Illinois downstate, I attended a series of seminars at the Hillel Foundation led by Professor Joseph Agassi. They were electrifying. In discussions about Martin Buber, the 18th century Age of Reason, the nature of myth, Agassi made me feel connected to a larger reality. I invited Ron to attend the discussions, and he too was captivated. The rest is history. Ron always acknowledged my matchmaking role in his life, but he put it like this: Jer, I don't know whether to bless you or curse you for introducing me to Agassi. 1965. I had transferred to Shimer College, and Ron came up to visit one weekend. I complained to him that I was lonely and feeling like an outsider at Shimer. Ron knew I was inhibited and worried too much about what other people thought of me. So he told me, Jerry, make an ass of yourself 3 times a day. That advice was liberating for me. It really was. For example, I had danced in grammar school, you know, the jitterbug and the cha-cha. But when the twist came, I stopped dancing. But after Ron's visit, I started dancing again. How did a 20-year-old Jewish guy from Rogers Park like Ron come up with that brilliant recipe? He was amazing. 2022. I admire Ron so much for his response to his illness. He knew perfectly well what the course of his illness would lead to. 2 months ago, he sat up in his bed and told me, Jer, these are the good old days. It took me a while to figure it out, but I mean, who else is going to say that? Lying in a bed, tubes in his nose. Jer, these are the good old days. Because he knew what was coming. But he kept writing and being worried about others. I myself have been navigating stormy waters in my personal life, and Ron was worried about me. He was not self-pitying or preoccupied with himself. Right to the end, he was thinking about other people and their welfare. Ron went through hell these past 2 years, but his spirit was intact. Using Elie Wiesel's words, Ron was a soul on fire.
Try to keep my composure, so I am a hitchhiker as well. I first met Ron in the 4th grade at Rogers Elementary School in West Rogers Park in 1955. We were friendly there, but I wouldn't say we were close friends. It wasn't until our junior year at Mather High School that we really bonded. We both were not in the mainstream of social life. We started having lunch together every school day in the cafeteria, eventually joined by our friend Jerry Taft. We would often get together after school and on weekends as well. Ours was a world of ideas and ideals, and not practicality. We read the anarchist philosopher Paul Goodman, listened to the lyrics of folk singer Bob Dylan, and recited poetry of Allen Ginsberg. 3 Jewish boys at Mather, finding 3 kindred Jewish voices, howling at the American mainstream. We all took different paths after college. Ron going into academia, I working in social services and government. and Jerry descending into the hell of mental illness. Ron stayed connected with Jerry Taft for 30 years, being there with both emotional and at times financial support until Jerry's death. When you were a friend with Ron, a true friend, you were a friend for life. Ron was a leader in the field of philosophy of education. He was esteemed among scholars nationally and internationally. He was passionate in his beliefs. He was a dreamer and an idealist and a fervent proponent of hope for mankind, even when observing mankind at its worst. When Ron moved to Michigan, I saw him every now and then. I'm going to guess maybe 15 to 20 times in 40 years. But when he left Oakland and came back to Chicago to be with family and friends, our friendship, our great friendship, resumed. We started taking walks with our old friend from Mather, Jerry Shenwar, discussing everything imaginable. And you know, with Ron, everything. He just had interest, I can't tell you, in not just philosophy, sports, history. He really was so knowledgeable about so many things. But most of all, Ron was a great listener. He was always respectful of our opinions, and he was the most non-judgmental friend that I ever had. I introduced Ron to the Schwitz, the Turkish baths at the Chicago Sweat Lodge. There he became reacquainted with our old friend Sid Hirsch and his brother Ronnie. And he met some new friends, Willie Carruth, Jimmy Lynn, and the man that we at the Schwitz looked up to the most, Joe Shade. Ron loved Joe, and I know Joe loved Ron. And the Schwitzniks had a name for Ron, the Professor. This past year and a half, I tried to visit Ron as much as possible. He knew that he had been dealt a bad hand with his deteriorating health. As his body weakened, his mind remained as strong as ever. He had hoped to host a poker game at his place, inviting old friends Jerry Shenwar, Sid Hirsch, Roger Gold, and me. He wrote out what the rules would be. We would play with dimes only, and no one would lose over $50. Ron's rules. Ron was writing academic articles throughout palliative and hospice care. Just 2 weeks ago, he finished a handwritten document that he gave to me to be typed, which will eventually be sent to the publisher for an article in a journal. I just still can't believe my dear friend Ron is not around to talk to anymore. And I'll always regret that we never got around to play that poker game with the guys.
All right, give me a minute. Basically, I want to start out with, Ron called me every day. And the first thing he says, do you have a minute? And I said, I've always got a minute for you. So please all stand and let's honor Ronald's minute. Okay, thank you. And Ron, I'll be there for you always. That's all I can say.
Oh boy, okay. This is perhaps foolish, but I am determined to do this. For as long as I can remember, my dad has been the historical memory of the Swartz and Diamond families. As time went on, he also assumed the role for the Bloch, Berlin, Rosenbaum, and now Morgen families too. He knows every name, every date, every story. People contact him, not infrequently, to ask questions or confirm information. How did Grandma Virginia die? What was Bloomy's real name? Where did David serve in the war? And who exactly was Cousin Edith? Not only was my dad the family historian, he was also, as a professor and philosopher, the Toastmaster of the family. The general consensus was that perhaps he had some wisdom to impart, and he was always asked to speak at family events. I get both my love of words and my bizarre memory from my dad. And although my memory is, believe it or not, nowhere near as good as his, it is my hope today to try and do justice to the story of his life and to share the wisdom he taught through his words and actions to so many of us. Ronald Mark Swartz was born on May 28, 1945. In the first of what would become many equivocations in his life, he was born between VE Day and VJ Day, and it was always hotly contested whether he was a baby boomer or a war baby. After Ron allegedly fell out of an upper floor window of the family's apartment on Hamlin Street, Barry is nodding his head, Ivan and Sylvia moved their brood to Chase Avenue, right at the corner of California and Touhy in sprawling West Rogers Park. Sandwiched between his older brother Barry and younger brother Bob, Ron was the consummate middle child. He was often referred to as Switzerland, and for his whole life, he never met a conflict he couldn't mediate, compromise, placate, or just flat out avoid. Grandma Sylvia was famous for chasing the boys around the dining room table with a shoe. Barry's nodding again. Hurling it at whomever was slow enough that day to get caught. When she got tired of that, she put the boys outside where they would ride their bikes to Fluky's for hot dogs, which was the only thing Uncle Bob would eat at any event, or to the fish keg for fried trafe. Or they'd hop on the L to the A line to Wrigley, where boys could still watch the Cubs lose for free if they wiped on the bleachers after the game. The Swartz brothers would always continue to bond over the Cubs and food throughout their entire life, sharing many late nights over pizza at candlelight after a game. Ron attended grammar school at Rogers Elementary and was one of the first graduating classes at the shiny new Mather High School. It was in grammar school that he met the likes of Ricky Reeder, Jerry Chenoir, Sid and Susan Hirsch, and Jerry Taft. After my parents moved back to Chicago in the last decade, my dad renewed these friendships and could be found at the Schwitz or playing pool at 9 a.m. on Western Avenue with the same friends he explored the north side of Chicago with 65 years earlier. From an early age, my dad had already begun to question how American education could look different. He wanted to know why and how, and was wholly dissatisfied with the answer because I said so. When a teacher told him to knock the chip off his shoulder, he quickly found himself kicked out of class when he went. One of my dad's favorite sayings, as you've heard, is that he is a day late but with an extra $1. And sure enough, the world opened up for Ron when he went downstate to U of I and met a young professor named Joseph Agassi. A student of Karl Popper and a radical thinker in all the ways that intrigued Ron, Agassi introduced my dad to new ideas, communities, and ways of thinking that he never even knew existed. Agassi took Ron under his wing and into his family, over the years nominating him for fellowships, doctoral programs, colloquia, and publications. My dad and Agassi steadily collaborated with each other for the last 60 years, and as recently as last month, were on the phone together, halfway around the world, discussing ideas for new projects. Around this time, my dad had the good fortune of standing up as a best man in his brother Barry's wedding to Barry's sweetheart, Sharon Berlin. Sharon's cousins did very well at that wedding. One of them married a friend of Barry's, and another, Susan Rosenbaum, married my dad. Ronnie and Susie hit it off at the wedding, and Ronnie was pleased to hear that Susie, too, was headed to Urbana after she graduated from Senn High School the following year. In another stroke of fate, the two bumped into each other shortly after Susie's arrival on campus, and after a bit of a scheduling mix-up that their first date was going to coincide with my dad's usual Friday night routine of studying at the library, they started a relationship that has lasted for over half a century. My parents got engaged in the middle of the blizzard of '67. While Sue finished up her degree at U of I, Ron did stints as a fifth grade social studies teacher in the far south suburbs, a sociology fellow at the University of Connecticut, a short order cook, a cab driver in the midst of the '68 riots, and in January '68, he began his doctoral program at New York University, with Susan planning to join him after her graduation. Ron had a complicated relationship with Judaism. He believed strongly in Jewish values and study, and was well read in Maimonides, Buber, and Spinoza. He also appreciated holiday traditions, especially when coupled with kishkes, latkes with sugar, and chopped liver. But organized religion was not for him, and he has always been a proclaimed agnostic. Indeed, although both my parents were Jewish, Ron went out of his way to find the only rabbi in Chicago at the time who would marry a Jew and a non-Jew. I think it has always been a nice connection for him that that individual, Rabbi Alan Tarshish, would go on to find the suburban temple where my family and I now belong. After their wedding, and with no time for a honeymoon, my parents immediately moved to New York. Living in Greenwich Village, they explored neighborhoods like Chinatown and Little Italy on a shoestring. Their friends at NYU introduced them to food, music, art, and experiences that were a far cry from what they knew on the north side of Chicago. Asabuco, Chagall, dim sum, Allen Ginsberg, Drambuie. My parents' shared love of restaurants and dining cultivated in New York would continue to be an important part of their relationship for many years going forward. Friday nights at Beverly Hills Grill, where they'd sit at the bar and talk to their favorite bartender. Sundays at DeLuca's or Pasquale's, and Saturday night was date night. Every so often, I'd be allowed to tag along, the only 7-year-old at Joe Muir's on Gratiot or the Whitney. And when I got restless, as 7-year-olds are wont to do, between the salad course and the entree, my dad would take me for a walk around the restaurant and maybe a peek in the kitchen. Following grad school, my dad landed a postdoc at Oakland University, and my parents moved to Detroit. He was awarded a tenure-track position shortly thereafter, and even better, was immediately allowed to stop his tenure clock and take a 1-year leave of absence to be a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics. Over the next year, my parents would live in London, travel through Europe, and eventually land in Israel, where they lived and worked on a kibbutz. The stories from the time on the kibbutz are legendary. My mom worked in the kitchen and washed eggs from the chickens, while my dad worked in the orange orchards and tended the coops. To this day, my dad cannot stand a down pillow, too many feathers. Ron's pace in the orchard was so abysmally slow that the other kibbutzniks thought him a drag. But their impression of him increased exponentially when Agassi called one day asking for Dr. Swartz. That man? He is a doctor? After returning to Detroit, Ron returned to Oakland, participating in Oakland's new interdisciplinary educational experiment called New Charter College. New Charter College was short-lived, but it was there that Ron would meet chemistry professor Bob Stern and European history professor Leo Gerolaitis, who would become his dear friends for the next 40 years. Our families would spend Jewish holidays and Thanksgiving together, where Ron would whip the cream by hand and make Grandma Bloomy's very buttery stuffing, a recipe he has since passed on to Alan. On Labor Day, my dad would potchki on the grill, while everyone argued about whether the faculty union would strike that year. I don't exactly know my beliefs on the afterlife, but I am certain that somehow, somewhere, Leo, Bob, and Ron are enjoying a cigar and a scotch together, while Leo and Bob try to unsuccessfully bait Ron into an argument. After living in various apartments around Detroit and the suburbs, my parents bought a bungalow on Derby Road, where I was born. When that got too small, they moved to Troy and bought a ranch house on an acre atop a hill on Tewksbury Lane. Ron would spend the next 20 years sweeping the porch, raking the leaves, fighting the raspberry brambles, and helping babysitters whose boyfriends got stuck in the snowbank on the steep side of the hill, and constantly wondering if the Bushes would make it that year. They always did. Because my dad had flexibility in his job, he was often the one who would care for me during the days before I started school, or who would be in charge of carpools after school activities. We would go to rotations of playgrounds, Oddballs Museum, and Feed the Ducks on Belle Isle. He took me to Greasy Spoons across the Metro Detroit area, Clancy's, The Flame, Jimmy's Coney Island, Ramshorn, The Stuffed Bun, and of course the Whistle Stop, where Peaches would let us come back in the kitchen. We would sit at the counter because my dad knew and wanted to endlessly schmooze with every favorite waitress, cook, or owner. They each had a life story he found fascinating, and he would remember the details about their families and their lives outside of work. When I started kindergarten, my dad persuaded my mom to enroll me in a non-traditional school that put some of his educational theories into practice. My attendance there was short-lived, but for 2 years, my dad and I would spend 30 minutes each day driving together to Upland Hills Farm School, listening to oldies on Honey AM radio and singing songs like It's a Grand Old Flag and Oh, What a Beautiful Morning. Ron's professional life flourished over his more than 40 years at Oakland. He published books, essays, and poems. He wrote everything in longhand and then literally cut with scissors and pasted with Scotch tape until his words were ready to turn over to his assistant or specially hired typists. Technology was never Ron's strong suit. While other families acquired VCRs in the 80s, we would rent a 16-millimeter film projector from Blockbuster to watch Laurel and Hardy shorts on the living room wall. Ron only recently learned to FaceTime and text, and one of my kids' favorite memories is the day that Grandpa tried to take a picture with a phone and Grammy just about fell down laughing. Ron believed students should be learning what they wished and how they wished. His final assignment each semester was always the same thing: ask and try to answer a question that interests you. He loved reading the responses he got, although he loathed grading them. And oh, the books. The walls at home and on campus were lined with books. His bedside had a rotating stack of paper books. He would spend hours perusing bookstores. Even recently, his hospital bed sagged under the weight of the books he kept close for a quick reference, and he begged Alan to wheel him to the other room so he could see his books. My parents remain the only people I know with a genuine reading room in their condo storage unit, complete with chair, rug, lamp, and framed wall art. When I introduced Alan to my parents, they embraced him as a son immediately. My dad didn't quite get Alan's dry, witted humor, but I think he was happy to not be the only man in the family anymore. Alan and my dad shared a love for dive restaurants, taking mini naps during Cubs games, and strolling around the neighborhood together. And as was his style, Ron embraced the whole Morgen family, sharing cigars with Alan's Uncle Ron, and during COVID, meeting my father-in-law Barry to eat bacon pizza from the Village Inn, side by side in their cars with the windows down to chat. My parents were both happy to return to Chicago after they retired, enjoying slow, multi-paced road trips around the country, short trips to Union Pier, wandering around the Art Institute, and eating countless meals at their favorite spots. They enjoyed being local, hands-on grandparents to Dana and Ian. Ron especially loved taking the kids to sporting events, despite the fact that he once bought tickets to a Bulls game that had occurred a month before. When our kids were younger, never ever did my dad leave our house without saying, "Phew, 2 is way more work than 1. As with most people, life dealt my parents some bumps along the road. They supported each other through the loss of all of their parents and my dad's beloved baby brother, Bob. My dad's mind is not uncomplicated, and as is often the case, with a little bit of genius comes a little bit of pain. They weathered these storms together and ultimately came out stronger together on the other side. As my mom became my dad's caregiver over the last year, he would constantly tell me that she was an angel and that he could rest easy knowing that she had been his partner on his journey. One of Ron's many mottos is that you can have everything you want, you just can't want everything. It is good advice to live by. And as I reflect on my dad's time with us, I think it is a motto that he was able to genuinely put into practice throughout his life. His life was not perfect. Whose is? But it was a life well lived, well read, and well loved. It was, as my dad would say, perfectly perfect in its imperfection. Those of us who loved Ron, and looking around this room today, there are so very many of us in that category, knew that he was a true one of a kind. He beat to his own drummer. We will each, in our own way, miss him deeply and always. And it is my wish, as I know it was his wish, that through us and our words and deeds, his life and now his memory will indeed have been for a blessing.
In his sorrow, Job cried out, Adonai Natan, v'Adonai lakach, yehi shem Adonai mevarach. God has given, and God has taken away. Death and sorrow are not strangers to those of us gathered to honor Ron. And with Job we say, Adonai Natan, God, you have given. You gave us a loved one who will not be forgotten. For all that was good and enduring in his life, we offer the deepest thanks of our hearts. Adonai lakach, God, you have taken away. We pray for the strength to turn our broken hearts into an altar of trust, before which we acknowledge your sovereignty and affirm Ron's love. Just from the few memories shared, it's so obvious that it's incredibly hard to encapsulate all that Ron was in just a moment. He was a son and a brother, a husband and a father, father-in-law, a grandfather, an uncle, a cousin, a friend, a teacher, a food aficionado, a book enthusiast, creative thinker. He was so much. So we've already heard Ron grew up here, just a little bit away from here, and found his life came full circle back to Chicago to be with his friends and with his family. He was incredibly close with his brothers. And just because he was in the first graduating, or one of the first graduating classes of Mather, doesn't mean that those newish people weren't people who were going to last in his life for the rest of his life. At University of Illinois, he met his beloved Sue, thanks in no small part to his brother and sister-in-law. And even though those first few dates couldn't really happen because of his library schedule, that one pizza date seemed to set the tone for the rest of Ron and Sue's life, sparking a love that would last just short of 54 years. When they both graduated, they moved to New York to enroll in New York University. Sue earned her master's, while Ron his PhD. And that became just their first taste of travel. They would soon go to London, to Israel, Michigan, and Chicago, and call each of those a short or long-term home base. But they also went to California and Italy and France, the Netherlands, Canada, so many places on so many adventures. Ron seemed to always be on the move, but never in a rush. And with each new or familiar location, he and Sue would take strolls, wander along a beach, go to restaurants, and think deep and important thoughts. When they settled in Oakland and welcomed Marla into their lives, Ron became her permanent companion, frequenting maybe every greasy spoon within driving distance. They would go to museums and parks, and he was never shy about being the only dad in that park. Though it seemed like Ron could almost find his way to become everyone's greatest friend. He was, as Alan said, the quintessential schmoozer. He was always asking questions to everyone within earshot. Marla's friends, waiters, bartenders, his physical therapists. He didn't just ask questions to be nice. He asked because he wanted to hear what they had to say. He wanted to remember these parts of people's lives, and he stored away the information until he would meet them again. His favorite restaurants, his colleagues at school, his friends at the Schwitz. Ron wanted to know everyone and believed that everyone was truly worth knowing. That seemed to be how Ron's mind worked. Self-guided curiosity became his passion, his philosophy, and the cornerstone of his career. He believed that everyone discovered the world in their own way, and usually learned more through the bumps and bruises that came along the way of life than by any structured curriculum. In fact, as Marla said, her early schooling was maybe a little test of that philosophy. Ron's choice of learning came through books and through conversation. He loved his books, and it seemed he had more than anyone could count except for Ron. He knew where every single one of his books was. And he loved them so much that when he and Sue moved here to Chicago, he would store a few in his brother's office because the condo wasn't quite big enough to fit all of them. He would debate and argue with his friends and colleagues. He hosted and moderated recorded dialogues to be shared with the whole school. And perhaps the more surprising part was that they were recorded and not that they were dialogues, because it seemed even a videotape, an audio tape were just beyond Ron's interest. But he wrote, he lectured, he studied, and he had every neuron in his brain firing at full blast all day, every day. Though that's not to say that Ron couldn't enjoy his life while philosophizing about saving the world through educational systems. As we've heard, he was a frequent restaurant goer, always finding something new and unexpected to order. He enjoyed playing and watching golf, though he never felt the need to keep score. He was a poet and writing poetry about the things and events and people that most interested him and about those whom he cared about most. He frequented that Schwitz, and he created and reestablished and preserved friendships that he truly cherished. He was a loving and doting grandfather, being sure to be present at dinners once a week, picking Ian and Dana up from school, taking them to Cubs games or Bears games, and Ron even helped Ian convince Marla and Alan to get a dog by saying he was only allergic to cats, though that wasn't maybe the full truth. But again and again, Ron found his way to food, and he found his way to people. He seemed to have pizza dates with everyone, with Barry, with Alan's parents, with anyone and everyone. He was always snacking. He insisted these last few months that Sue take time for herself by going back to some of her and their favorite places. It seemed like everyone who knew and loved Ron would, at some point, find themselves sharing a meal. Ron was always looking for just a taste of a meal, a taste of a book, a taste of a destination, a taste of your story, a taste of the things that Ron knew mattered most. This week in our Torah, we read of the blessing that the Israelites received as they continued on their critical journey through the wilderness, struggling to understand what it meant to be imperfect, autonomous, and capable. Though Ron wouldn't have been so eager to hear the direct translation of this blessing, which invoked God, it seems to me that he lived by a philosophy that only would be a slight variation from the original. May you find goodness and purpose. May the light and love of learning guide you through dark times. May you lift up and be lifted up by everyone around you. May the love you discover grant you fulfillment. And may your every today be just a taste of tomorrow's promise. In the depths of grief, God, keep these best parts of Ron's presence and Ron's memory strong, so that those who loved him may rely on that strength. We grieve for what might have been, for joys unrealized, for tasks undone, for hopes thwarted, for love blighted, and challenges unmet. Help us to bring consolation to his family, to his friends, to his community. Help us to raise them from the depths of sorrow, slowly and lovingly. Help us to lead them from the night of desolation to the dawn of another. Then the memory of their beloved son, brother, husband, father, grandfather, uncle, friend, and teacher, that memory will be able to return gently and peacefully to their hearts. May his memory live among each of us, allaying grief and instructing in the ways of living, helping each and every one to find meaning in the mystery of eternal life. Zichrono livracha, may Ron Swartz's memory always and forever serve as a blessing. In moments like these, when our hearts are breaking, our tradition gives us two prayers to say. These prayers go together and are meant to complement each other when words can be hard to formulate. This first prayer, El Malei Rachamim, is a prayer for Ron, for his eternal soul, and may he finally find comfort and wisdom in everything that he was searching for in life. May he continue to bestow that to those who remember him. And the second prayer, Kaddish Yatom, Mourner's Kaddish, is a prayer for all who remember him, who take the memories of someone who lived an interesting, someone who lived a passionate, someone who lived a curious life, and may those blessings support them for the rest of their own lives. First, a prayer for Ron, and then a prayer for all of you. El Malei Rachamim, please rise if you are able. El Malei Rachamim, Shochein Bamromim, Hamse Menucha Nechona Tacha Kanfei HaShechina, Im Kedoshim Utorim, Kezohar Ki Hamatirim, Et Nishmat Reuven ben Ivan, Shehalchach leolamo, Ba'al harachamim yastirehu b'seter kanafav leolamim. Bitzror hachayim et nishmato, Adonai hu nachlato, v'yanuach b'shalom. משכבו ונאמר אמן. On the inside of our pamphlets, we read the translation. O God, full of compassion, thou who dwellest on high, grant perfect rest beneath the sheltering wings of thy presence, among the holy and pure who shine as the brightness of the firmament unto the soul of Ronald Mark Swartz, who has gone unto eternity. Lord of mercy, bring him under the cover of thy wings, and let his soul be bound up in the bond of eternal life. Be God's possession, and may his repose be peace. Amen. And on the back of the pamphlet, we'll find Kadisha Tom. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah, be'alma divra chirutei v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayachon uvyomechon, uv'chayet kol beit Yisrael, ba'agala uvizman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shmei rabbah mevarach le'olam olmei almaya, yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yithalal, shmeid kudsha berechu, le'ela min kol berchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechamata, da'amiram be'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav, hu yaseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imru amen. Oseh shalom, shalom b'mromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imru amen. Zichrono livracha, may Ron's memory always and forever be a blessing. And together we say, Amen. Please be seated.
This does conclude the service at the chapel. The interment will be private, so immediately following the service here, the family will be receiving condolences sitting Shiva at the Morgen residence, 2031 Glendale Avenue in Northbrook, and they'll be today and throughout this evening until 8 p.m. Also, you might notice there are some no parking signs on Glendale Avenue. The police have authorized people to park there, so ignore those signs. You'll never hear that again, but you don't have to worry about them. The police have okayed it. At this time, I would ask that everyone please rise as the family, the rabbi, and Mr. Swartz are escorted from the chapel.